And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
Imagine a situation where the global economy suddenly finds itself on the brink of a major trade conflict that could shake not only Europe and the US, but the entire global market. In the midst of this tension, President Donald Trump unexpectedly announces the introduction of 50% tariffs on all goods imported from the European Union, starting June 1st. This is not just another threat, it is the largest tariff ever imposed on the US's largest trading partner. Imagine that this decision could affect almost every sector of the economy, from cars and airplanes to food and even amusement park rides. But that's not all. At the same time, Trump is giving Apple an ultimatum. Either the company starts mass production of iPhones in the US, or it will face 25% tariffs, which could lead to sharp price increases and serious consequences for the electronics market.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
This news has already sent shockwaves through global financial markets. European stock indices are plummeting, currency exchange rates are unstable, and experts are warning of a possible slowdown in economic growth and rising inflation, not only in Europe but also in the US itself. However, the most alarming thing is that, in response to the US actions, the European Commission is preparing an unprecedented package of countermeasures worth over €100 billion. Tariffs will be imposed on thousands of American goods, including aircraft worth €13 billion and cars worth €7 billion. Moreover, Europe plans to file an official complaint with WTO, which could trigger a cascade of lawsuits and diplomatic confrontations.
There's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
But don't think that this war will be limited to goods and tariffs. Digital technology and the IT sector are becoming another battleground. Brussels is already developing new technical requirements and rules designed to reduce Europe's dependence on American cloud service providers. In addition, digital taxes are being introduced on giants such as Amazon, and legal regulation of large technology companies is being tightened. With each step, the confrontation becomes deeper and more comprehensive, threatening to paralyze the usual channels of international trade and technological cooperation. Experts are sounding the alarm. If these measures are implemented, the consequences could be catastrophic for the global economy. According to forecasts by leading economists, US GDP growth could fall by almost 1.5%, and the Eurozone risks finding itself on the brink of recession. In addition, there are fears of sharp price increases for consumers and a decline in the investment attractiveness of the US market, as unstable and unpredictable policies are scaring off investors. The situation is exacerbated by the fact that such threats and countermeasures have been repeated many times in the past. Recently, we witnessed a temporary truce in the trade war between the US and China, when the parties suspended the most severe tariffs and began negotiations. But now everything is repeating itself with renewed vigor on the European front. Global markets are nervous, politicians are preparing for tough diplomatic games, and companies are bracing themselves for unprecedented changes in supply chains.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
In this video, we take a detailed look at why Donald Trump decided to escalate the trade war again, what countermeasures Europe is preparing, and how all this will affect the economy, markets, and ordinary consumers. We will look at which goods and services will be at the epicenter of the conflict, why digital technologies have become a new battlefield, and what awaits us in the coming months. Get ready to learn about the latest developments, expert analysis, and hidden nuances that could change the fate of international trade and affect every wallet on both sides of the Atlantic. Stay tuned, because this conflict is just beginning, and billions of dollars, millions of jobs, and the future of the global economy depend on how it unfolds.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
At the beginning of this year, the world watched with restraint as complex and protracted trade negotiations between the United States and the European Union unfolded, hoping for a reduction in tensions. It seemed that after weeks of disagreement, the moment had finally come when the parties would be able to find a compromise and move away from extreme measures. For several weeks, there were even signs that Donald Trump was ready to soften his toughest tariff threats, which sparked cautious optimism in the markets and among politicians. However, all hope was dashed when the US president unexpectedly announced his intention to impose 50% tariffs on all imports from the European Union starting June 1st. This decision was not only shocking, but also unprecedented in its scale. Such a level of tariffs has virtually never been applied in the history of trade relations between the two largest economic blocs. This move was presented as a response to stalled trade negotiations and what Washington considers to be Europe's inappropriate behavior.
That's a 10. That's a good one.
At the same time, President Trump issued an ultimatum to the American corporation Apple. Either the company begins mass production of its iPhones in the US, or it will face a 25% tariff, which threatened to sharply increase prices for end consumers and create serious difficulties for businesses. This news sent shockwaves through the technology sector and caused considerable concern among investors. The suddenness of such measures raised questions about how well prepared and thought out this policy is, given its potential to destabilize already fragile supply chains.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
President Trump did not limit himself to a dry statement. He signed the executive order right in the Oval Office, which gave the whole process a sense of formality and underscored the seriousness of his intentions. In his statement on social media, he openly stated that the US is not seeking a deal under the current conditions, as it accuses the European Union of creating excessive trade barriers. In particular, he pointed to value-added taxes, VAT, digital service taxes, unfair lawsuits against American companies, and currency manipulation, which, in his opinion, lead to an annual US trade deficit of around $250 billion. At the same time, official data from the US Department of Commerce show that the deficit in 2023 amounted to $236 billion, which suggests that this statement was somewhat exaggerated in order to mobilize public opinion and increase pressure on European partners.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
The European side reacted immediately and without delay. The European Commission not only announced the preparation of a large-scale package of retaliatory measures worth around your 100 billion, but also began to develop specific mechanisms for retaliation. The package includes duties and restrictions on more than 4,800 US goods, imports of which exceeded your 109 billion in 2024. The most significant in terms of value were US aircraft, with imports of around your 13 billion, and cars worth your 7 billion. In addition to large sectors, the list also included symbolic goods such as parts for American roller coasters, agricultural products, chemicals, and even scrap metal. This demonstrated the EU's intention not only to respond to US actions, but also to show that the response would be comprehensive and serious, affecting broad sections of the US economy.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
At the diplomatic level, Brussels decided to extend the confrontation to the international arena, announcing its intention to file official complaint with the World Trade Organization. This initiative was aimed at questioning the legality of the US's unilateral tariff measures and achieving a fairer solution through international mechanisms. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen stressed that, despite its willingness to engage in dialogue, Europe has no intention of backing down and will use all available instruments to protect its interests. It should be noted that this confrontation is not limited to tariffs on goods. In the context of Trump's complaints about European fines and regulations on American technology companies, the EU has begun to actively develop measures aimed at reducing dependence on American suppliers in the digital sector. This includes the introduction of technical restrictions and new rules designed to protect European markets and citizens' data. Analysts note that such measures could create serious barriers for American tech giants and change the rules of the game in the global market.
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
The next significant tool is digital service taxes, which the European Union has been actively introducing in recent years. These taxes are aimed at ensuring that American tech giants pay their fair share of taxes on revenues earned in Europe, especially given that many of them use low tax schemes in individual countries. Taxes on advertising revenues from Amazon and other companies have already become the subject of heated debate. According to a number of economists, these measures are designed not only to increase budget revenues, but also to reduce the advantage of American corporations, which previously effectively circumvented their tax obligations. However, studies show that the main financial burden ultimately falls on end consumers, as companies pass on additional costs to users through price increases and seller fees. Finally, the third and most powerful tool is stronger regulation and fines. The European Commission has already imposed heavy fines on Meta and Apple, amounting to hundreds of millions of euros, and is awaiting a decision in the Alphabet case. These sanctions are based on new laws such as the Digital Markets Act, DMA, and the Digital Services Act, DSA, which significantly expand the powers of European regulators to control digital markets and ensure data sovereignty. The DSA already applies to Elon Musk's social network X, demonstrating the EU's willingness to enforce its rules even against the most influential players. These laws introduce requirements for algorithm transparency, user data protection, and combating disinformation, which means significant changes in strategy and additional costs for US companies. All these measures form a comprehensive digital strategy for the European Union, aimed at reducing the influence of American corporations and creating a competitive technological ecosystem within Europe. At the same time, experts note that tensions in this area will only grow in the coming months, as neither side is willing to back down. This confrontation is becoming a new front in the global trade war, which could slow innovation and increase costs for both companies and users. Economists and analysts are not hiding their concerns about the scale and consequences of this escalation. Bank's chief economist in the Netherlands, Casper Beresy, warns that such high tariffs and trade barriers could trigger a real economic crisis, slowing growth and increasing inflation. If the US threats are carried out, GDP growth in the Eurozone could fall to a level close to recession, while inflationary pressures in the US itself would intensify, negatively affecting consumers and investment. According to forecasts by Julian Heinz of the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, the US economy could lose up to 1.5% of its growth, which is a serious blow for a large economy and could trigger a chain reaction around the world. Neil Shearing, senior analyst at Capital Economics, draws attention to the unpredictability of US policy, where tariff threats are becoming a tool of political pressure without a clear strategy, which is negatively affecting financial market confidence. He points to Moody's downgrade of the US credit rating as a reflection of the growing risks associated with the country's economic policy. With a growing budget deficit and uncertainty in trade policy, investors are increasingly wary of investing in US companies. Syracuse University economics professor Mary E. Lovely notes that the Trump administration's main goals, stimulating domestic production and investment, could be jeopardized by high tariffs and retaliatory measures. Faced with a sudden increase in the tax burden and uncertainty in foreign markets, companies will be forced to revise their plans, which will reduce the attractiveness of the US for investment and jeopardize economic growth. Thus, although the US-EU trade war began with threats and the introduction of tariffs, it quickly turned into a multi-level confrontation encompassing digital technology, legal regulation, and economic strategy. All these factors create significant uncertainty for businesses and investors and pose new challenges for the global economy. So far, neither side is ready to make serious concessions, which makes the prospects for a quick resolution of the conflict extremely vague and highlights the high risks of further escalation. The history of trade threats and retaliatory measures between the US and other major economic players, including the European Union, is not new, but it is now reaching new and unprecedented levels. Just a few months ago, the world witnessed a tense trade war between the United States and China, with both sides exchanging threats and imposing tariffs that peaked at over 100% on certain groups of goods. At that time, the US announced tariffs of up to 145% on Chinese goods, and China responded with its own measures of 125%. However, after a long period of mutual threats and economic pressure, at the beginning of the year, both countries agreed to temporarily suspend the most severe tariffs for 90 days and begin negotiations in the hope of finding a compromise. This cycle of threats and retreats, tensions and truces seem quite predictable and typical of the trade conflicts of the last decade. But things are different with Europe. Despite previous concerns, many analysts did not expect such a sharp and large-scale escalation as the one initiated by Donald Trump against the European Union. Experience with negotiations with China has shown that under pressure, both sides tend to seek solutions that can reduce tensions. However, today's US rhetoric toward Europe is more aggressive and less predictable, which strengthens the determination of European leaders not to give in to pressure. Brussels clearly understands that concessions in this case will be perceived as weakness, so it is preparing to take a tough line, demonstrating its readiness to use all available levers of influence and sanctions in response to tariff measures. European officials have already stated that if the US carries out its threats in full, the EU's response will be immediate and uncompromising. This intention underscores the strategic importance of relations with the United States, and at the same time demonstrates a readiness for a trade war the likes of which the world has not seen since World War II. In the event of further escalation, not only a decline in trade volumes is expected, but also serious political consequences, the strengthening of protectionist sentiments, the rise of nationalism, and a decline in the level of international cooperation as a whole. Experts believe that such events could lead to the division of the world economy into separate blocks, which would significantly complicate global integration and technological development. Markets have already begun to reflect these fears. The euro has weakened sharply against the dollar, currency speculation has intensified, and stock markets are experiencing a period of high volatility. European stock indices, especially in the automotive sector, which has been at the epicenter of the conflict, fell by several percent in a single day. Analysts attribute this to expected declines in corporate profits and rising costs associated with retaliatory tariffs and logistical challenges. Currency fluctuations are also putting pressure on the economy by making imports more expensive and increasing uncertainty for investors. In addition, domestic monetary policies are responding to these challenges. The European Central Bank is considering additional monetary easing, including interest rate cuts, to support the Eurozone economy. According to unofficial data, the market is already pricing in an additional rate cut of around 70 basis points in the coming months, reflecting the expectations of investors and economists. Meanwhile, the exchange rates of major currency pairs, such as Euro-JPY and Euro-GBP, are showing signs of a weakening euro, which further indicates heightened anxiety in financial markets.